Picture this. It's August 1854, and you're walking through Soho. Not the trendy Soho of today. This Soho reeks of something unspeakable. Every breath feels thick, contaminated. You pass a water pump on Broad Street, and neighbors are gathered around it like it's the last source of hope in the city. Within 3 days, 127 of them will be dead. But here's what nobody understood yet. The water wasn't hope. It was death itself, served cold from a communal tap. London in the 1850s was the richest city on earth, and it was quite literally drowning in its own filth. We're talking about a metropolis of 2.5 million people, most living in conditions that would make a medieval peasant weep. The Thames wasn't a river anymore. It was an open sewer, a slow-moving tide of human waste, animal carcasses, industrial runoff, and the occasional bloated corpse floating past Westminster. Every house, every tenement, every factory dumped their waste into cesspools, basically brick-lined pits in the ground that were supposed to hold everything until the night soil men came to empty them. Except they'd overflow. Constantly. Sewage would seep through walls, leak into basements, pool in the streets. In summer, the smell was so overwhelming that people would vomit just walking outside. And the Thames, that majestic symbol of British power, it was basically a cholera incubator. Dead dogs, raw sewage, factory chemicals, it all went in. And then, because nobody had figured out germ theory yet, Londoners would drink from it. They'd wash in it. They'd cook with it. The result was predictable: cholera outbreaks that killed tens of thousands. 1832, 6,500 dead. 1849, 14,000 dead. 1854, another 10,000. These weren't just numbers. These were mothers, children, workers, collapsing in the street as their bodies expelled every fluid they had until there was nothing left. The Victorian establishment had a theory for all this death, and it was completely wrong. They called it miasma, bad air. They genuinely believed that disease was caused by foul smells drifting through the city like malevolent fog. So their solution: open the windows, burn incense, maybe build a few more parks. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody realized that the very thing they were dumping into the ground and the river was coming back to kill them through their drinking water. The wealthiest empire in human history was being slaughtered by its own waste, and almost nobody understood why, except for one man. A quiet, methodical engineer with thick sideburns and an obsession with math. His name was Joseph Bazalgette, and he was about to build something so audaciously over-engineered that his bosses would call it wasteful, his critics would call it insane, and history would call it one of the greatest infrastructure projects ever conceived. But first, things had to get worse. Much, much worse. June 1858. London is experiencing a heatwave. Now, heatwaves in Victorian London weren't like heatwaves today. There was no air conditioning, no electric fans, no escape. Just brick buildings that trapped heat like ovens, and a river that was essentially a sun-baked cesspool stretching through the heart of the city. The Thames had always smelled bad, but this was different. The stench rising from the river was so overpowering that people couldn't function. Workers fled their jobs. Steamboats cancelled service because passengers were too nauseated to travel. Street vendors abandoned their carts. This wasn't just unpleasant. This was a biological assault on the senses, a smell so thick and putrid it felt like you could see it. And then it reached Parliament. Picture this: the most powerful men in the British Empire, sitting in the House of Commons, trying to conduct the business of governing a global superpower while gagging on the smell of human excrement wafting through the windows. They soaked the curtains in chloride of lime. They hung lime-soaked sheets over every opening. Nothing worked. Benjamin Disraeli, future Prime Minister, was seen fleeing the building mid-session, handkerchief pressed to his face. Members of Parliament literally couldn't stay in the chamber long enough to debate. Committees were abandoned. Sessions were cut short. The Thames had done what no foreign power could do. It had brought the British government to its knees. The newspapers had a field day. The Great Stink, they called it. Political cartoons showed MPs with clothespins on their noses, Father Thames as a diseased old man surrounded by filth. One writer described the river as a fermenting sewer whose solid ingredients were barely liquid anymore. But here's the thing that's often overlooked. The Great Stink didn't actually kill many people. It just made life unbearable for the people who mattered, the wealthy, the powerful, the legislators. Cholera had been killing the poor for decades, and Parliament had dragged its feet. But the moment the smell invaded Westminster, suddenly there was urgency. Suddenly there was money. They'd been talking about fixing London's sewage problem for years. Committees had been formed, reports had been written, proposals had been debated and discarded. The Metropolitan Commission of Sewers had been bumbling along since 1848, accomplishing almost nothing except arguing about which parish should pay for what. But Joseph Bazalgette had been waiting. He'd been appointed chief engineer of the commission in 1856, and he'd been quietly, methodically working on a plan, not a modest plan, not a let's fix this gradually plan. No, Bazalgette had designed a system so massive, so forward-thinking, that when he finally presented it to Parliament, they thought he'd lost his mind. He wanted to build 82 miles of massive brick sewers, some big enough to drive a carriage through, beneath the entire city. He wanted to intercept every drop of sewage before it reached the Thames, divert it east through enormous underground tunnels, and pump it miles downstream where the tide would carry it out to sea. The cost, £3 million, in 1858 money. That's roughly £350 million today, but probably closer to several billion in real terms considering what infrastructure costs now. And here's the genius part, the part that nobody appreciated at the time. Bazalgette didn't just design the system for London's current population. He doubled his calculations. He built sewers twice as large as the city needed because he was convinced London would keep growing and he wanted his system to last. People thought he was insane, fiscally irresponsible, building tunnels for a city that didn't exist yet. But the Great Stink had created a brief, precious window where politicians were too nauseated to argue. In July 1858, 18 days into the worst smell in London's history, Parliament passed the enabling legislation. They gave Bazalgette his budget, his authority, and basically said, "Fix this. Now." What they didn't realize was they just greenlit one of the most consequential engineering projects in human history. Joseph Bazalgette wasn't supposed to be the man who saved London. He was born in 1819 to a family of French descent. His grandfather had fled the French Revolution, and he'd trained as a civil engineer at a time when the profession was still figuring out what that even meant. He worked on railway projects, analyzed drainage systems, spent years doing the unglamorous work of calculating flow rates and surveying land. In 1847, he had a nervous breakdown. The details are murky, but he basically worked himself into physical and mental collapse. He disappeared from public life for 2 years, recovering in the countryside, probably wondering if his career was over. Then, in 1849, cholera struck London again. His mentor, the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers, dropped dead of exhaustion trying to manage the crisis. Bazalgette, still recovering, watched from the sidelines. When he finally returned to work in 1852, he joined the commission as an assistant engineer. He was quiet, meticulous, almost invisible in meetings. While other engineers proposed grand, flashy schemes, Bazalgette sat in his office and did math. Lots of math. He studied rainfall patterns, population density, flow rates, gradient calculations. He measured the Thames at different tides, charted where sewage accumulated, tracked disease outbreaks across different neighborhoods. He wasn't just designing sewers, he was designing a circulatory system for an entire city, and he was obsessed with getting every detail right. By 1856, when he became chief engineer, he'd already sketched out his plan, and it was audacious. Most proposals at the time involved modest improvements, better cesspools, a few drains here and there, maybe diverting some of the worst overflow. Bazalgette looked at those plans and essentially said, "That's not ambitious enough. We need to rebuild the entire system from scratch." His plan had three key elements. First, build a network of massive intercepting sewers on both sides of the Thames, north and south, that would catch all the sewage before it reached the river. These weren't delicate Victorian pipes. These were brick cathedrals underground, some over 6 feet in diameter, built to last centuries. Second, use gravity wherever possible, but don't be afraid of pumping stations where gravity wouldn't work. This was revolutionary. Most engineers avoided pumping because steam engines were expensive and temperamental. Bazalgette embraced them. He designed massive pumping stations, industrial palaces with ornate architecture above ground and powerful engines below, that could lift millions of gallons of sewage uphill when needed. Third, don't just fix today's problem, build for the future. This was the part that made people think he was reckless. London's population in 1856 was about 2.5 million. Bazalgette designed his sewers for 4 million. He literally doubled his capacity calculations because he believed the city would keep growing and he wanted his system to handle it. His critics were relentless. Too expensive, too ambitious. Why are we building sewers for people who don't exist yet? The Times called it extravagant. Budget-conscious MPs grumbled about fiscal responsibility. But Bazalgette had one thing on his side. Nobody else had a better plan. And after the Great Stink, the political will was finally there. So in 1859, construction began. And that's when everyone discovered just how insanely difficult this was going to be. Try to imagine this. You need to dig a trench 10 feet deep and 10 feet wide through the heart of one of the world's busiest cities. You need to do this for miles, under streets, under buildings, through neighborhoods where every inch of space is occupied by shops, homes, factories, and people who very much don't want you tearing up their lives. Oh, and you're doing this in the 1860s. No excavators, no power tools, no modern safety equipment. Just pickaxes, shovels, and thousands of laborers working in conditions that would be illegal today. Welcome to Joseph, Bazalgette's nightmare. The northern intercepting sewer alone, the main artery of the system, ran for over 17 miles, from Hampstead in the west all the way to the Abbey Mills pumping station in the east. It had to maintain a precise gradient the entire way, just enough slope to keep sewage flowing, but not so steep that it would erode the brickwork. Bazalgette's surveyors would go out at night with lanterns and measuring equipment, calculating elevations down to the inch. A mistake of even a few degrees could cause sewage to pool, back up, or overflow. They were threading a needle through an entire city. The construction was brutal. Workers, mostly Irish and English laborers earning a few shillings a day, would dig open trenches, sometimes 20 feet deep, shored up with timber supports that could collapse without warning. Men died, not in ones or twos, but regularly. Cave-ins, gas explosions, disease. The records are incomplete, but we know dozens died building this system, probably many more. And then there was the Thames itself. 3 of the major sewers had to cross the river. Bazalgette couldn't go under it. The riverbed was too unstable, and underwater tunneling technology was still primitive. So he went over it. He designed massive new embankments that would reclaim land from the Thames, narrowing the river and creating new boulevards above ground while hiding enormous sewers below. The Victoria Embankment, built between 1865 and 1870, is still there today. You've probably walked on it if you've been to London. Gorgeous riverside promenade, trees, benches, a pleasant place to stroll. What you can't see is the massive brick sewer running beneath your feet, still carrying sewage after 150 years, still doing exactly what Bazalgette designed it to do. Building the embankments meant dumping millions of tons of earth into the Thames, holding back the river with retaining walls while workers built the sewers inside. It was one of the largest earth-moving projects of the Victorian era. The noise, the dust, the disruption. Londoners complained endlessly. But Bazalgette didn't stop. He was racing against time and cholera. He also had to build pumping stations, 4 major ones: Abbey Mills, Crossness, Diptford, and Weston. These weren't just functional buildings. Bazalgette insisted they be beautiful. Abbey Mills, in particular, is an architectural masterpiece. It looks like a Byzantine cathedral, with ornate ironwork, stained glass, and decorative stonework. Inside, massive beam engines, each weighing over 50 tons, pumped sewage upward so it could continue flowing east toward the outfalls. Why make them beautiful? Because Bazalgette understood something fundamental. Infrastructure projects are easier to maintain when people take pride in them. If you build an ugly shed, people let it rot. If you build something magnificent, they preserve it. Abbey Mills is still standing, still operational. He was right. By 1865, the main system was operational. By 1875, it was complete. 82 miles of main sewers, 1,100 miles of street sewers feeding into them, 318 million bricks laid by hand, enough concrete to build a small city. And it worked. Cholera cases began dropping immediately. The 1866 outbreak, which killed 5,500 people in the East End, barely touched the areas where Bazalgette's sewers were operational. By the 1870s, cholera had essentially disappeared from London. The Thames began to recover. Fish returned. The smell faded. People could open their windows in summer. But here's the thing nobody fully appreciated at the time. Bazalgette hadn't just fixed a smell problem. He'd prevented disasters that hadn't even happened yet. London's population in 1865, 3 million. London's population in 1900, 6.5 million. London's population today, 9 million. Bazalgette's sewers, the ones his critics said were wastefully oversized, the ones built for a city of 4 million that didn't exist yet, they handled all of it. That's the part that takes your breath away. He wasn't just solving the problems of his time, he was solving problems that wouldn't emerge for another 50, 100, even 150 years. Most of Bazalgette's original sewers are still in use today, still carrying waste, still functioning exactly as designed. When people criticized him for overbuilding, for wasting money on excess capacity, he'd calmly reply, "Well, we're only going to do this once." He knew something his critics didn't. Infrastructure is unforgiving. You can't easily upgrade a sewer system once it's buried under a city. You build it right the first time, or you build it twice. And because he built it right, London avoided catastrophes that destroyed other cities. When Paris, Berlin, and New York were still struggling with waterborne diseases well into the 20th century, London was safe. When those cities had to tear up their streets repeatedly to upgrade failing systems, London's kept working. The life expectancy in London rose dramatically. In 1850, before Bazalgette's system, the average Londoner lived to about 40. By 1900, it was over 50. By 1950, over 60. Clean water didn't just prevent cholera, it reduced typhoid, dysentery, and dozens of other diseases that had plagued cities for millennia. It's impossible to calculate exactly how many lives Bazalgette's sewers saved. Tens of thousands directly from cholera prevention. Hundreds of thousands from other waterborne diseases. Millions when you account for the long-term improvements to public health across generations. And yet, his name isn't on the tip of anyone's tongue. Ask most people to name a famous Victorian engineer, they'll say Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the flashy genius who built railways and ships and bridges. Brunel is celebrated, romanticized, remembered. There are statues, documentaries, societies dedicated to his memory. Bazalgette, there's a small monument on the Victoria Embankment. Most people walk past it without noticing. Maybe it's because sewers aren't sexy. They're hidden, unglamorous, literally underground. Nobody writes poems about wastewater management. No painter ever captured the majesty of a brick tunnel carrying excrement. But Bazalgette's legacy is everywhere. Every time you flush a toilet in London, you're using his system. Every time you turn on a tap and drink clean water without fearing cholera, you're benefiting from his obsessive forward thinking. He was knighted in 1874, recognized by his peers and government. He continued working on civil engineering projects until his death in 1891. He died at home, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see his system succeed beyond all expectations. And here's maybe the most beautiful part. Bazalgette's design philosophy spread. Engineers around the world studied his work. New York built its sewer system based on his principles. Paris renovated its network using his techniques. Cities across the British Empire, Toronto, Melbourne, Mumbai, hired engineers trained in the Bazalgette method. He didn't just save London. He created a blueprint for modern sanitation that's still used today. Here's what I keep coming back to. Joseph Bazalgette never discovered a new law of physics. He never invented a revolutionary technology. He didn't have a dramatic eureka moment. What he did was simpler and harder. He looked at a problem everyone knew existed, a problem that was killing thousands of people, and he refused to accept a mediocre solution. He did the math. He made the hard calculations. He insisted on building something that would last, even when it seemed excessive. And then, quietly, methodically, without fanfare, he built it. Victorian London wasn't saved by a charismatic politician or a daring adventurer. It was saved by an engineer with sideburns and a slide rule who understood that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is overbuild a sewer. The next time you're in London, take a walk along the Thames. Look at the embankment, the clean river, the thriving city. Millions of people living safely because one man, 150 years ago, decided to do the job right. No monuments, no statues in every square. Just a city that works and keeps working because someone cared enough to build it properly. That's the legacy of Joseph Bazalgette. And maybe, just maybe, that's a better monument than bronze or marble could ever be.